Think for a moment about a time when you felt, just completely entirely out of place.
Oh, yeah, that is a rough feeling.
Right. Like maybe you would just move to a new city where you didn't know a single soul.
Mm.
Or maybe you were walking into a room on the very first day of a completely different career.
Yeah, you get that sort of stomach-dropping sensation.
Exactly. It's that feeling where the reference points you usually rely on to tell you who you are and well, where you fit are just suddenly gone.
It is a deeply visceral feeling for sure. Being unmoored like that, it kind of strips away your armor. You're left trying to navigate a world that just doesn't seem to have a designated space for you anymore.
Now, I want you to take that feeling, that intense, overwhelming disorientation, and I want you to scale it up.
Hmm.
Imagine making it permanent.
Right, which is a terrifying thought.
It really is. Imagine turning it into a lifelong forced condition where you literally cannot go back, even if you desperately want to. That is the reality of political exile.
Yeah, and today's deep dive is taking us straight into the psychological depths of that exact experience. We're exploring identity, migration, and what it actually takes to rebuild a shattered sense of self.
And to do that, we are leaning on a really fascinating perspective from someone who actually lived it.
Right. We have this deeply insightful 2025 interview. It was published in the Confluence Journal of Multidisciplinary Studies, and it features the renowned Moroccan novelist Abdelhamid El Beyuki in conversation with researchers Mariam Bououda and Brahim Barhoun.
Okay, let's unpack this, because El Biyuki is not, sitting in some ivory tower theorizing about displacement.
No, not at all.
Back in 1984, following these political uprisings in the north of Morocco, the government handed him a 30-year prison sentence in absentia. He literally had to flee for his life.
Yeah, he spent 16 years living abroad. He was primarily navigating these sort of liminal spaces between Tangier and Madrid, and he didn't set foot back on Moroccan soil until the year 2000.
Which is just a massive chunk of a person's life.
Absolutely. His entire creative and philosophical worldview is forged in the fires of that displacement.
Right.
And our goal today is to look impartially at how El Bayuki's grueling life experiences translate into this radical rethinking of humanity. He really forces his readers to ask what it means to be, quote unquote, human in a modern world that is increasingly obsessed with drawing and militarizing these rigid borders.
What immediately caught my eye in this interview is how he views the concept of returning home.
Oh, yeah, this part is so interesting.
Because the standard Hollywood narrative tells us that exile has a really clear beginning and a clear end. You flee, you suffer, and then eventually you cross back over the border into your home country, and the music swells.
Right, the exile is over, roll credits.
Exactly. But for El Biyuki, that neat little timeline is a complete illusion.
Hmm.
He realizes that crossing the physical border back into Morocco did absolutely nothing to end his exile.
Right, he fundamentally challenges the whole timeline of displacement. Like, if you were to look for a traditional autobiography from him, he warns that you wouldn't find a chronological point A to point B kind of story.
It's way more messy than that.
Exactly. He describes his life as a fragmented mosaic of broken experiences. He lived these multiple lives that overlapped across different times and places. He was constantly torn between his political activism and his literary ambitions.
Right, between European streets and Moroccan memories.
Yeah. And the ultimate proof of this ongoing, sort of endless condition is actually right there in his publication history.
Oh, right, with his first novel.
Yeah, his first published novel is called Eyes of Exile, but it didn't come out until 2013.
Which is crazy because that is more than a decade after he physically returned to his homeland.
Exactly. The interview notes that he views this massive delay as a kind of confession. He's confessing to the world that the person who eventually returns is absolutely not the same person who originally left.
What's fascinating here is how he defines his sense of self after all of that. He says he is the sum of the characters he imagined.
Right, because his reality was fundamentally shattered by being forced away.
Wow. The sum of the characters.
Yeah. For El Biyuki, writing fiction isn't an aesthetic luxury. It isn't just a hobby he picked up to pass the time in Madrid.
It's survival.
It is a vital existential necessity. He is using words to meticulously reconstruct a self that the state tried to permanently break apart.
It makes me think of an analogy to put this in perspective for our listeners. It's a bit like moving back into your childhood bedroom after you've been away for 10 or 15 years.
Oh, that's a good way to look at it.
You walk through the door, and the physical architecture is perfectly identical. The walls are the exact same color. The window looks out at the exact same tree. but you have lived a whole other life.
Right, you're a completely different person now.
Yeah, you have changed on a cellular level. So because you are different, that entirely familiar room suddenly feels completely alien. It's almost more jarring and isolating than being in a foreign country because you expect to feel at home and you just don't.
Exactly. The physical geography remains, but the psychological geography has completely shifted beneath your feet. And that massive internal shift, well, it brings up a really difficult mechanical question for a writer.
Right. How do you capture that?
Yeah, if your identity is that fragmented, how do you actually put it onto a printed page? You obviously can't just use standard paragraphs and expected plot points to convey the feeling of a totally shattered life.
Which brings us to the architecture of his literary style. El Beyuki argues that exile literature is not just some tiny subcategory tucked underneath general migration literature.
No, he says it is an entirely distinct genre with its own set of rules.
And the interview draws a really sharp contrast to highlight this. It brings up the famous French philosopher and author Albert Camus.
Right, Camus.
Camus often sought what he called a zero-degree or non-style of writing. He wanted a prose that was stripped down, very neutral, and highly objective.
Right, a very clean approach. But El Beyuki argues that an exiled writer must do the exact opposite. A tidy, clean form simply cannot authentically represent a broken, messy reality.
So instead of a clean, linear style, exile literature relies heavily on linguistic hybridity.
Yeah, the text notes that El Beyuki constantly blends different languages together. He mixes the gritty real world with this surreal, dreamlike world.
And he does this to capture that dizzying feeling of alienation, right?
Mm-hmm.
He goes as far as to say that for the exiled writer, the physical country is gone, so language itself becomes the homeland.
Which is such a powerful concept.
It is, but I have to push back a little bit on behalf of the reader here.
Okay, let's hear it.
If I pick up a novel and the author is constantly blending different languages together, breaking traditional narrative rules and, jumping randomly between reality and dreams, I'm probably going to put the book down.
Fair enough.
Doesn't that risk making the text incredibly confusing? It just sounds inaccessible for the average person who just wants to understand the human story.
It is a totally valid concern, but the interview addresses the underlying mechanism, the actual why behind the stylistic choice.
Okay, so why do it?
The linguistic hybridity isn't a parlor trick meant to deliberately confuse or alienate the reader. It is an attempt to be painfully authentic to the mixed reality of the migrant.
Oh, I see.
Think about it. When you live between cultures, your internal monologue isn't pure. It's a total hybrid. Your thoughts are a messy combination of the language you dream in and the language you order your coffee in.
That makes a lot of sense, actually.
And to contextualize this, El Beyuki points to James Joyce and his notoriously difficult masterpiece, Ulysses.
Right, a classic example of breaking the rules.
Exactly. Joyce lived in voluntary exile from Ireland, and from that geographic distance, he engaged in wild, unprecedented linguistic experimentation. He broke almost every traditional barrier of the English language.
And he did it for a specific reason.
Right. He did it specifically as a way to dissect and cling to his Irish identity from afar. El Beyuki is employing a very similar mechanism. The blending of languages is simply the sound of a human mind trying to hold two completely different worlds together at the exact same time.
So the form of the novel literally has to match the feeling of the author. The chaos on the page is the chaos in the mind.
Exactly.
If we follow that logic, it makes me wonder how he applies this very specific, chaotic literary style to the real world.
Yeah.
Specifically, how does he write about the deeply polarizing modern issue of border crossings?
Well, he takes this intensely personal literary style and he sort of weaponizes it for political empathy. He argues that literature has a critical responsibility to challenge the dehumanizing stereotypes we are constantly fed by the media regarding migration.
We see this all the time, right?
Yeah.
The media often reduces people to broad statistics or frames them strictly as a threat or an economic burden.
Yeah, it's very clinical and disconnected.
But literature, El Beyuki says, operates completely differently. It shows you the granular human tragedy. It puts you in the mind of a father desperately trying to hold on to his children in a sinking boat in the Mediterranean.
Right. It forces the migrant out of the category of faceless political issue and turns them into someone familiar, someone who loves, fears, and hopes, just like you.
We see this mechanism clearly in his novel, The Hybrid.
Mm.
In the narrative, irregular migration is not portrayed as some casual lifestyle choice or a calculated scheme to steal jobs.
No, it is portrayed as the tragic, unavoidable outcome of an oppressive reality at home.
There's a really powerful quote highlighted in the interview from a character in that novel named Siham. She says, "We are all from here and elsewhere. The essence of identity is plurality."
Yeah, that's such a striking line. He takes this exploration even further in another novel, Walking on the Wind. This one focuses on the harrowing journeys of African migrants moving through Morocco, trying to reach Europe.
And he uses the story to put Western immigration laws on trial, doesn't he?
He does. The text quotes him asking a very blunt question. How can a person be clandestine? What does it mean to classify human beings as legal or illegal?
So what does this all mean for us as readers? To me, it highlights the vast difference between information and empathy.
Oh, absolutely.
Reading news statistics about a border crisis is, it's like reading a restaurant menu. You know the ingredients, you can see the prices, you understand the facts on a sterile level.
Right, you get the gist of it.
But reading a novel is like actually eating the meal. It forces you to taste the reality, the bitterness, and the grit of the experience. You can't just glance at it and walk away.
That is a perfect analogy.
And I want to pause right here and remind you, the listener, that in keeping with the mission of our show, we are exploring El Beyuki's specific critique of these racialized Western laws and what he calls hollow human rights slogans.
Right, we are just looking at his perspective.
Exactly. We aren't taking a political side on global immigration policy here. We are impartially reporting how this author uses fiction to dissect the systems of power that categorize human lives.
This raises an important question, though, about how nations define themselves in the first place. It really brings up the obsession with purity.
Purity, like cultural purity.
Yeah. El Beyuki cites the Spanish writer Juan Goytisolo to explain this. Goytisolo argued that human identity is inherently bastard.
That's a strong word.
It is, but he didn't mean that as an insult. He meant that identity is inherently illegitimate, mixed, and entirely non-pure.
So there's no such thing as a pure identity.
Exactly. Goytisolo and El Beyuki, by extension, suggest that whenever a society or a government becomes obsessed with pursuing some pure, authentic nationalist past, they aren't actually recovering real history.
We're making it up.
They are manufacturing a distorted, impoverished caricature. Because if you look at the actual mechanics of human history, it is just one long, messy, unbroken story of migration, vixing, and displacement. Pure identity is basically a myth used to keep people out.
Wow. If El Beyuki is using literature to prove that laws categorizing people as illegal are absurd, it makes me wonder how he views other massive systems that try to categorize us.
Oh, he has a lot to say about that.
Because immigration law is just one tool of power. What about the broader systems that tell us who we are, like official history or organized religion?
He tackles those massive systems head-on, starting with how we actually record the past. In his novel, The Bridegroom of Death, El Beyuki steps into the genre of historical fiction. And to challenge official history, he relies on a concept from the philosopher Paul Ricoeur called narrative temporality, or, more simply, the time of meaning.
Wait, hold on. Narrative temporality sounds like the kind of academic jargon that puts people straight to sleep.
Yeah, I know, it sounds a bit dense.
What does meaningful time actually look like on the page? How does a novelist use that against official history?
Let's look at the mechanics of it. Official history gives you a very sterile timeline, gives you the dates of treaties, the names of kings, the casualty numbers of wars. That is neutral, physical time.
Okay, just the raw facts.
Right. But a novel produces meaningful time by building microhistories. It focuses on the quiet, hidden, terrifying stories of regular individuals that official history completely erases.
Oh, I think I see what you mean. It's the difference between a wide-angle drone shot and body cam footage.
Exactly.
Official history is the drone hovering 5,000 feet in the air above a burning city. You can see the whole grid, you can see the troop movements, but you can't hear anyone screaming. The novel is the body cam strapped to one person desperately trying to pull their family out of the rubble.
That is the perfect way to visualize it. The interview actually compares this mechanism to Pablo Picasso's famous painting, Guernica.
Oh, wow, yeah.
Guernica doesn't give you the factual, logistical statistics of the Spanish Civil War. It gives you fractured faces and screaming animals. It communicates the visceral truth and the horror of that history far better than a textbook ever could.
So El Beyuki's doing the same thing, just with words. He is reclassing history from the state and giving it back to the individual.
Yes, precisely. And he applies a very similar dismantling process to religion in his collection, Stories of Exile. Here, he leans on the theories of the French philosopher Michel Foucault.
Okay, another heavy hitter.
Right, but without getting bogged down in Foucault's dense academic texts, the core mechanism El Beyuki borrows is the relationship between power and knowledge. He uses this to critique how religion becomes commodified.
Commodified religion. How does that work in this context?
Well, the central idea is that systems of power maintain their control by dictating what is considered absolute truth. El Beyuki illustrates how this happens with religious discourse.
Right.
He shows that far too often religion is stripped of its sincere spiritual faith. Instead of being a path to personal enlightenment or moral goodness, it is weaponized as a tool for political domination.
So the state uses it to control people.
Exactly. The state or the ruling class uses the threat of divine punishment to enforce strict behaviors, silence dissent, and essentially control the masses.
When you look at his critiques of immigration laws, official history, and weaponized religion, a really clear picture emerges of what El Beyuki believes a writer's actually supposed to do.
Yeah, he takes the role of the author very seriously.
The interview brings in three major thinkers to define the role of the intellectual in society: Edward Said, Antonio Gramsci, and Jean-Paul Sartre.
It's a powerful triad, and each provides a specific mechanism for resistance. From Edward Said, he takes the idea that the true intellectual must operate from the margins.
Right, you can't be part of the establishment.
Exactly. You have to live in a psychological state of exile, refusing to comfortably assimilate into the ruling class, because standing on the outside is the only way you can clearly see and call out the injustices happening on the inside.
From Gramsci, he takes the idea that an intellectual cannot just sit in a cafe having deep thoughts. They must actively challenge the stories the ruling class forces us to believe.
Yeah, they have to help shape a new historical consciousness for the working class.
And finally, from Sartre, he adopts the stark reminder that writing is not passive. As Sartre put it, the word is an action, and silence is a form of complicity.
Choosing not to write about oppression is basically choosing to endorse it.
But here's where it gets really interesting. Amidst all this heavy theory about power, state control, and political domination, El Beyuki introduces his ultimate tool for resistance.
And it is not what you would expect.
No, it's not a weapon, it's love. He draws on philosophers like Hannah Arendt, Judith Butler, and Roland Barthes to present love as a radical ethical stance.
Yeah, this is a beautiful part of his philosophy.
Now, I have to play devil's advocate here. We were talking about a man who was handed a 30-year prison sentence. We were talking about militarized borders, violent oppressive regimes, and people literally drowning at sea.
Right, very grim realities.
In the face of all that massive systemic violence, presenting love as a tool of political resistance sounds incredibly naive. It sounds like a pop song lyric, not a strategy. How does a novelist actually wield love against a government?
I get that it sounds soft on the surface, but philosophically, it is an incredibly sharp blade. Think about how power systems actually function.
Okay.
Whether it's the racialized immigration laws we discussed or the commodified religion El Beyuki critiques, these systems rely entirely on putting human beings into strict, hostile categories.
Right. You're either legal or illegal.
You are either a believer or an infidel. You're either us or them. Love is a radical political act because it is the only human experience that completely destroys those categories.
Oh, wow.
As Judith Butler argues, our identities are not fixed. They are shaped and altered by our relationships. When you truly love someone, you are creating a space where you fully accept another person's differences, their complexities, and their otherness.
And crucially, you do this without trying to coerce them, label them, or control them.
Exactly.
I see the mechanism now. By integrating the other into the self through love, you are actively refusing to play the government's game. You are refusing to participate in the dehumanizing categories that the power structure demands you use.
Spot on. Love heals the wounds that a violent, categorized past creates because it recenters the human being.
It proves that encountering someone different from you doesn't have to be a confrontation or a threat. It can be an opportunity for profound renewal. It dismantles dogma from the inside out.
It really is a brilliant counterattack.
That is incredibly powerful, and it really brings us full circle on the journey of this deep dive. We started with a man who was forced into political exile in 1984, entirely stripped of his home, his language, and his reference points.
Yeah, he lost everything.
But instead of letting that fracture destroy him, Abdelhamid El Beyuki used the mechanics of writing to painstakingly reconstruct himself.
He realized that fragmentation isn't a failure, it is simply the reality of the modern human condition. His work reveals that identity is not some pure, static monument that we have to fiercely guard from outsiders.
Right.
It is a beautiful hybrid mosaic constantly being added to.
I love the specific advice he gives at the very end of the interview. He speaks directly to the new generation of bilingual and bicultural writers. He tells them, do not see this duality as a burden. Write in your mother tongues, even those that may not belong to any official dictionary.
That is fantastic advice.
He urges them to view their internal contradictions not as flaws that need to be fixed, but as a deep narrative reservoir from which they can draw strength and endless creativity.
A narrative reservoir. I love that phrasing.
And that is something I want you, the listener, to take to heart. The parts of you that feel contradictory, the parts of you that feel like they belong to different worlds or different past lives, that isn't confusion. That is your own internal narrative reservoir.
Which leaves us with a final, rather provocative thought to consider, one that really builds on El Beyuki's theories.
Let's hear it.
If true identity is found precisely in the tension of exile, in the blending of multiple overlapping worlds, does that mean that in our highly connected, hyper-globalized modern world, we are all living in a state of permanent psychological exile?
Ooh, that's a heavy thought.
Think about it. We are all constantly navigating between different digital spaces, shifting cultural norms, and overlapping realities. We are all, in a sense, unmoored from the traditional singular definitions of home.
Yeah, the world is just moving too fast for a static home now.
Exactly. And if that is true, how can we use that shared feeling of uprootedness not as a source of anxiety, but as the ultimate tool for empathy? How can we use our own internal exile to finally understand the other?
That is a profound question, and one I really encourage you to mull over until our next deep dive. Take that feeling of being unmoored and see if you can find the empathy hidden inside it. Thanks for joining us, and we'll catch you next time.